Welcome to the State of Accessibility podcast from TPGI on LinkedIn Live. I am Mark Miller, and this is my co-host, Dr. David Sloan, Chief Accessibility Officer for Vispero, co-author of What Every Engineer Should Know About Digital Accessibility, and a user research and accessibility strategy specialist.
And Mark is a sales director for TPGI and a member of W3C's Web Accessibility Initiative Accessibility Maturity Model Task Force.
David, we have a special guest this month.
We
The
do.
one and only Matt Ader, Vispero's Senior Vice President for Business Development, and the person who may well have a world record for taking the most video recordings of inaccessible kiosks. Welcome, Matt.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks, David. I'm so happy to be here. I also take videos of ones that are good too, so not just the bad ones.
So you have two world records, and fantastic.
Maybe three, because it would be inaccessible, accessible, and just kiosks overall, right?
Well, the funny thing about the videos is probably the number one video that gets watched on LinkedIn is one about using an elevator. And for any of you, and I know you both have seen these in hotels before, where now they're using touch screens for elevators, which nobody has a problem if touch screens are accessible, but they added a button to basically turn on the text to speech, and it's indicated by a wheelchair button, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is the symbol for the global symbol for accessibility. And when you press it, it just starts counting down. Well, if you're on floor 74 and you want to go to floor 1, it's a long count from 74 down to floor 1.
What if you miss it halfway down the countdown? What if you're like, oh, I wanted 3 and it's on to 2 now?
It's exactly, and then you end up on 2. And that's part of the challenge. So,
wow. Well, it's an appropriate video for today because we say the word kiosk all the time, but really what we mean is enclosed systems, which is anytime hardware and software is sort of married together, which is the case with this elevator as well. So that's a good example of the types of things that we're going to talk about today. So on that note, Matt, can you kind of give us your definition of kiosk? What do you mean when you say the word kiosk? Like, what is that broader meaning that you personally have?
I think you said it, Mark. I mean, it's really closed systems. It's anything you can't, as a person with a disability, bring your own assistive technology to. It could be a conference system that's in a conference room that has a tablet attached, and you can't add your own screen reader. You can't add your own keyboard. This is something that's in a conference room supplied by a third-party vendor. It could be, the tablet on the bike. It could be the elevator that we already gave. And then, the more common ones that people think about are self-service kiosks,
right,
self-checkout in restaurants, or excuse me, in grocery stores and places like that. Vending machines now are being outfitted with tablets on the front to manage inventory and do all kinds of stuff that a traditional vending machine wouldn't have done. Those are now basically kiosks or self-service devices. Payment devices, we've all make payments at counters now. Are those accessible? We make payments at our table sometimes. Are those accessible? And people who are blind or have other disabilities, they want to be able to do the same things everybody else is doing. And in a payment device, I want to be able to know what my tip is. I want to know what the amount is. Otherwise, somebody else is actually doing it for me, which doesn't seem that accessible.
So I guess it's we often might think they're just the big, heavy, stationary things that you walk up to or roll up to and use, but really it's like any handheld device as well that you might be given or lent to do something, and then you got to give it back and you can't configure it.
Right. You may be able to configure it if the text to speech or the keypad's been added. You may be able to turn that on, but by default, if they've not added this functionality, it becomes an inaccessible device. And broadly, like you just both of you have said, it's if you can't add your own stuff, it becomes somewhat of a closed device, closed systems. And we started with this with ATMs in the United States. With ATMs, there's a headphone jack, a keypad, there's Braille descriptions on how to use it. Those are things that have existed for a while, thanks to organizations like the National Federation of the Blind and others who pushed for accessibility.
So
Well,
yeah, go
oh,
ahead, Mark.
things. Yeah, one of the things that struck me, Matt, you were talking about like, and to your point, David, that we think of kiosks as these big heavy things, but when you sit down at a restaurant now, somebody hands you essentially a handheld kiosk to make your payment and put your tip in for your meal. And I can remember, Matt, when you and I first met, so this is probably 2013, 2014, way back when we had a meal together, and you had me help you because you're one of the people who would use this assistive technology, right? Being that you're blind, you had me help you with a receipt, which at that time was printed out in manual, and you wanted me to help you with a tip and make sure you're signing in the right spot. Well, now you can be very independent with that. And if those devices come with assistive technology, because to your point, you're not able to bring your own. So can you tell us a little bit more about why designing these types of things, these experiences? Why is it because now that is the way you're interacting in a restaurant or wherever the case may be? Why is there so much attention to it today?
Well, some of it is laws and regulations. The European Accessibility Act has put some emphasis on it. We also have businesses who care, right? Which is also a big plus. I
Yeah.
still believe that the overall business segment of accessibility around self-service or these types of closed devices is probably 10 years behind web accessibility in terms of people understanding the needs of the person with a disability, and or putting the requirements in to make it accessible. Now, one would argue that if 96 to 99% of websites are inaccessible, you could probably say something very similar to even a higher level for self-service devices or closed system devices. So I think part of it is that. Part of it is the influence by disability community to push for change. Uh, you know, so there's been some really great successes in it, and then there's been some real negative ones. I mean, if you look at the check-in experience at um, two of the biggest lawsuits in the last couple of years were around LabCorp and Quest Diagnostics, and whether or not a blind person was able to check in one of those places where they don't have somebody at a counter checking you in. It's just a tablet screen.
And just for the audience, Matt, who may not be familiar with those companies, this is kind of healthcare settings, right?
Yeah, it's where you in the United States, and I'm not sure it's anywhere else in the world with those two companies, but it's where you go get your blood drawn, right? You go get your diagnostics done. And so if your doctor says you need to go get blood work done, they're probably one of the two places, there may be three, but they're two of the places that are most likely to be sent to.
So in that case, there's accessibility barriers preventing somebody from receiving some aspect of healthcare, which is
Yes.
not a good situation to be in.
Yep.
So you mentioned web accessibility there. What makes building accessible kiosk experiences different to other digital accessibility efforts? I mean, there's a lot of conversation about building accessible websites or mobile apps, and a lot of understanding of what needs to happen, even if it hasn't always happened as well as we'd like. Why is building accessible kiosks different?
It's probably more directly focused on the user's workflow than it is the entire screen. It's mostly about an interaction and the time to get an interaction done. If I went up to a kiosk and took 10 minutes to place an order, I got people in the queue behind me. It's probably very frustrating for a business to think that that's an efficient use case. So, when we look at a kiosk, and I think the Air Carrier Access Act had it right in terms of functional accessibility, meaning that can you functionally, and this is my term, not theirs, can you functionally perform the tasks of the device? Can you go to an airline and check in, print your boarding pass? Can you make a payment on a payment device? Can you at a restaurant, say as McDonald's, can you order a hamburger get a French fry and a drink, change your drink from small to large, add a tip, and then hit submit and get your receipt and get your food. I mean, if we can do those things, then it becomes very similar. There are some differences in to drive the user through the workflow that we may, that WCAG doesn't take account for. The WCAG does not take account for in terms of how do you move the user fast through a workflow. And so there's probably a few things that in design that we may break to drive the user that are, I'm not going to call them non-compliant, but one would argue that they probably are not exactly the same as what WCAG calls for.
I'm just thinking, that's WCAG kind of sort of assumes that we're providing flexibility for how somebody interacts with an interface. So, for example, a screen reader user navigating a web page might choose to navigate through using heading navigation, or maybe using tab key to jump to tabbable objects, and then, or might be searching for specific content. But with a kiosk, you don't have the full QWERTY keyboard and the full selection of keyboard shortcuts, which must change things significantly.
It's more of a prescribed path. And it strikes me too that if you think about all the different areas where you run into a kiosk, you're like, I always think of the airport, right? You got to print out your baggage tag, or even just buy. For those of you who travel a lot, you probably haven't had to interact with somebody if you're buying, your mixed nuts before you get on the plane or whatever it is. All those things are now kiosks. So it's got to be even more, even sort of scarier and more important when those things aren't accessible. When you run into, if you're at home at your computer, it's a definite frustration, but I think that it kind of levels up the seriousness of it.
Yeah, and the example that David gave about not having a QWERTY keyboard is a big part of it. It's like, you don't need to read by word and character and line and check spelling of things in a kiosk. You don't have the time to do it. And if you are spending the time doing it, then it's probably not the good use case. When you're limited to the number of keys you have or swipe gestures you have, the navigation methods are just different. And so they're more like tab, shift tab. They're more like enter, move by heading, or region, depending on what it's going to be one or the other, but not both. Increase volume or speed, which, volume is key. I think speed is this is an opinion, not, individual opinion, not a fact of, each business will make their own decision here. I don't think speed of the screen reader is critical for a 2-minute experience. Whereas some would say, hey, I need to have the ability to adjust speed of the kiosk, of the screen reader.
So what do you think, what are the biggest challenges? We've sort of talked around these things, but if you had to call out the biggest challenges that we see today, and where today's kiosks tend to fall short, what are those things in your mind?
First, laws and regulations are not caught up to really push. I mean, the United States is a perfect example of that. The European Accessibility Act is doing a better job at this for Europe. Two, businesses are not putting requirements in, and unless they put the requirements in, the people building the kiosks, either hardware or software, and I'll talk about both of them in a second, they're not going to add accessibility features if they're not required to. Because if accessibility costs even $1 more, they don't want to lose an opportunity to somebody else who didn't add it. And then when you think about from a hardware perspective, if the business is going through a hardware manufacturer, they're not that involved in the software accessibility, but they will do the things. I think most people follow the regulations around hardware accessibility, screen height, tilt, having objects in the way of a wheelchair pulling up or a cane getting stuck, things like that. Most companies are getting those things right. When we get into the software side, those software companies may be the interaction between the customer, or they may be being built by the customer themselves. And are they adding the accessibility features and components? And so I think it's how the customer is, one, following regulations, two, not putting requirements in, and three, working with a vendor that may be hardware or software who doesn't understand accessibility.
And that
So
there
what
needs.
does that, I was going to say,
Go ahead.
what does that lead to, and what are the biggest accessibility barriers you've encountered when using a kiosk?
People will think about the hardware accessibility first. So you'll go and you'll see a kiosk that has a headphone jack and a keypad, and you'll plug in headphones and nothing happens. So they've met the requirements. Hey, they said, oh, make this ADA compliant. That's like the best phrase in the world, ADA compliant. And then they'll put the physical accessibility pieces in for hardware, but they won't add anything for software. So they've not considered the connection between the two. And then, on top of that, we have just a broad problem in terms of getting businesses to truly understand and adapt accessibility in their portfolio. And you see it with, self-checkout today. I mean, as of today, I've not seen a single self-checkout machine that's accessible in a store where you go and process your own order of things that you have in the cart. Not one. And maybe there's one coming. I think there's one coming. But
I'm going to go search Matt for one, and I'm going to take a video of it so I can.
Yeah, I would love to see it.
The only person to get a video of
prove it to me. Prove it to me. Somebody out there in the world, prove it to me. I'd love to see it.
Yeah.
And I know folks who are working on it today, which I think is great.
So,
and we'll see something this year, I'm pretty sure.
That's fantastic. And so on that note, right, kind of flipping the script around here, what is good out there? What have you seen out in the wild from a kiosk standpoint that's really working well at this time?
I think there's some great payment devices from Stripe, from Adyen. They're based out of the Netherlands, Stripe's in the US, and I think they're deploying in Canada and places like that. I think McDonald's does an amazing job, mostly in the US today, South Korea, starting Europe soon. I am really impressed with some of the work that even things like the blood pressure machines in your CVS's and your Walgreens, Rite Aids. I'm not even sure how many of those types of companies, pharmacies, grocery stores, where you sit down at a machine. There's some of those that have the ability for you to check your blood pressure. United Airlines, I think, has done an amazing job with their accessibility. And I think airlines have been on top of this longer because of the Air Carrier Access Act, and the requirements around it. I think everybody should bring a set of headphones with you and try it. I mean, that's the number one thing. Like, even if you're not blind today, try the experience and see if you can listen to it and go through the whole experience. I've seen taxis that have the tablets on the back of the passenger front seat, where you pay through the tablet, and I've been really impressed with that user experience. So those are some examples, but I mean, there's plenty of them out there.
And just for people who may not know, Matt, you've mentioned that headphones a couple of times, and that is because of ATMs and because they've been accessible for so long. When you plug that headphone jack into a device, the idea and what would happen with an ATM or another accessible kiosk is that it automatically knows now that a person who needs the screen reader included in that, that's available on board that kiosk. And it starts to announce things through the screen reader. Is that why you're mentioning that to try the headphones?
Yeah, and I would add there's a couple of reasons for the headphones. One is that we want privacy in some cases, so you need that. Two, we need the ability to start and stop it. And I've seen some kiosks that have like a button on the bottom right corner of the screen to tap to get audio, or in the case of the taxis, you just triple tap with your finger and it starts the audio. But we also have the need, as I mentioned, the privacy side, but there's also a point where some businesses don't want something talking out loud.
Right.
If you're in a store that's already noisy, like a restaurant or a self-checkout at a store, and if it starts chattering everything you're doing, and there may be things you're scanning that you don't want everybody to know what you're scanning,
Right.
even though sighted people can look over your shoulder and see it.
Yeah. It's
But
different than having it announced out loud.
right.
Hey, look at
And
what this guy's buying. These are Oreos over here.
exactly. And something we added in software that the Sparrow and TPGI has is that we add privacy. So you can
Yeah.
actually turn the screen off as a feature. And that kind of stuff is, I think, really important. We did in some use cases support USB-C headphones, but
Mhm.
right now their 3.5 millimeter jack headphones is the most standard. I know people think, oh, that's old technology. Why aren't we using Bluetooth? Well, it's a security problem around Bluetooth. And then secondly, how do you pair it? And it becomes a problem
That's
of how do you
yeah.
go around pairing? And
Yep.
does your device stay paired when you're finished? And how do you pair it if you're blind, if you can't start it in the first place to actually get the pairing process started? So there's
Right.
a lot of things that we could be thinking about a good solution for down the road, and maybe those technologies will change over time. But today, sadly, we still carry around the 3.5 millimeter jack headphones like the old-fashioned radios would carry.
At least it's not a
The
transistor.
Walkman. The Walkman.
Yeah, the Walkman, right? So, can you talk to us about some successful strategies for creating accessible kiosks?
Well, I think first is get a consultant to sit down with you and think through the workflow of the user. Make sure that you can interact with all elements on the page. Those are basic. They could be buttons, links, whatever they are. Contain as many things within the element as possible. Let's use the example of ordering food. You don't want it to say burger, then separately you figure out the price, separately you figure out the calories. You want them all combined into one element so that the user can easily get through it. You need to be able to support dialogues properly. You need to have proper alerts and messaging being provided to the user in terms of starting and stopping, or messaging around things being added to the bag or removed, or quantity increases, price increases as you increase quantities.
Mhm.
There's a lot of kind of things in that, but adding a screen reader is a critical component. Working with somebody with a keyboard, not a keyboard, a keypad, like for example, Storm Audio Nav, supporting touch, and we mimic using an iPhone in our touch experiences, because some people still like to use touch experiences. Understanding the differences between accessibility and the three, kind of main platforms, Windows, Android, and Linux are kind of the three main platforms. Making sure that you understand, if you're a manufacturer of this tech or you're someone buying this technology, understand the limitations to each. Some handle audio better than others. Some handle peripherals better than others. Some handle keyboards better than others. And I'm talking like on-screen keyboards. Become a different experience. Blind people use on-screen keyboards every day with their iPhone. You start expanding that to a wide screen, that on-screen keyboard has a different feel and experience, and it takes longer to navigate. And I'm not saying it can't be done. It's just a totally different experience. Those are probably some of the main themes that I can think of.
I was just gonna, I was thinking out loud about or I am thinking out loud about some of the other challenges. Just I love the way you talked earlier about the focus on task completion and user experience. And when you think about where kiosks are in public spaces, in places where people might be operating under stress because there's a big line of people behind them, or in an airport, where people are flying from another country, jet lagged, speaking a different language, that kind of ease of use and simplicity must be really important. And then I was always thinking about the instructions for using the kiosk. And I remember an example of a recent kiosk evaluation I did where there was audio instructions telling you where everything was laid out, but they were wrong because they might have been recorded for or programmed for a previous kiosk, and it said that the input device was at 3 o'clock to the screen, but it wasn't. It was at the bottom of the screen. So I guess that speaks to the need to be connected, like, or to have everything integrated in terms of accessibility. Like you don't just use the same instructions over and over because the device might be in a different place. And I feel like you told me, Matt, about an example of like a train ticket machine where the instructions were wrong. It was accessible, but the instructions made you think it wasn't.
Yeah, and that one was the Virginia Rail Express. I mean, I love throwing a few people great videos on this topic. It is a fully accessible machine, so I want to be really clear. So I don't want anybody to go out there and complain that they don't make an accessible machine, but their instructions fail. Their instructions in Braille tell you to plug in headphones. Now, this is where the failure between hardware and software happened. So, someone else made the hardware, put the Braille on there, put the headphone jack and all of those things and tell you to do that. But then nothing happens when you plug in the headphones. But somebody walked up behind me and says, well, if you're looking for audio, you just tap the bottom right corner of the screen and it'll start talking. And it did, but it does it out of the speaker. So the headphone jack is completely not needed on this device. So the collaboration between the software and the hardware failed in this case. I didn't mention this, but I think also positioning of that keypad in a convenient place is also great and very important, because if it's not, you're going to have to put Braille instructions somewhere to tell somebody where it is. I find Braille instructions all the way down almost to the bottom of machines, sometimes like vending machines. I found a keypad at the bottom of a vending machine. Well, who's feeling all the way down to the bottom corner of the vending machine for the keypad? And so those kind of experiences, again, are things that people should be thinking about. Where's the appropriate place to put it? What's the appropriate angle to put it at? I know that I'm not sure how much time we have, but I'll give an example of an elevator. Think about Braille on an elevator, and if the buttons are really low on the elevator, a blind person's reading Braille upside down. They're not reading it right side up, and that's okay. Just because I can't take my hand and position it like this and read letters that are down by my knee. And so I'm going to read it upside down, but helping people understand how that method works can also help people understand when they're building self-service devices, putting Braille way down at the bottom of the machine if you don't know it's there is probably problematic.
So I guess we're, as we get towards the end of the conversation, looking into the future, it's almost like every podcast, is it, Mark? We end up talking about AI or EA.
We have to talk about AI. Yeah.
So how do you see AI disrupting the kiosk user experience? Is it going to make a difference, do you think?
So I think what it's going to do is it's doing a lot of transactional stuff behind the screen that is not the something that the user's interacting with. Where you see it being impactful today is in things like drive-through ordering. A lot of that is AI today. It's hearing you speak and say what you want, and you'll see things getting added and removed from the thing as you tell it to do it. But does a restaurant want that to happen inside of a store, like where you're talking to the machine and it's talking back to you out loud? Probably not. But what it is doing a lot of the other things, like, hey, it knows it's me, and it's bringing up ideas and things that are based on my, profile and what I've done in the past. But the concept of, and there is really great technology out there. One of them is called SoundHound, and SoundHound's doing this for drive-through. I think their experiences are amazing. What I don't know is how often that's going to be inside of a place rather than outside from the experiences.
That makes sense. Well, Matt, this has been a fascinating discussion, and I feel like we could just keep going. Unfortunately, we only have a half an hour, so we do have to wrap it up. But it's just amazing to me how we can know digital accessibility, we can understand hardware or physical accessibility. But when you combine the two, you really have something different, and it's clear that it's our next frontier, right? We need to really work to understand it and understand how to put it into processes and get all these different elements, the hardware, the software, the customer, the consultant, working together to deliver accessible kiosks. So thank you very much. Before we sign off, I want to remind everyone, please join us on September 23rd at 10:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time for the next State of Accessibility podcast on LinkedIn Live, when we're going to talk about the Inclusive Design 24 event, also known as ID24. Now you know the state of accessibility. I am Mark Miller, thanking David Sloan and Matt Ader, and reminding you that the state of accessibility is always changing, so please help us affect change.